Last month, I was watching Dead Boy Detectives to make up for the loss of Lockwood & Co., not to be mistaken for Lock and Key. These are all shows on Netflix focusing on the supernatural with plenty of ghosts. They're all part of a pretty popular genre, horror supernatural television. And it just seems to be getting more and more popular. It has a long history. Dark Shadows in the 60s, Twin Peaks in the 90s, Supernatural ending in 2020 with 15 seasons, the longest running of this category. But something I've always loved about these shows is how important the environment, the place it's set, is to the storytelling. You can't have a haunted house story without a haunted house. And isn't that story going to be even cooler if you have a haunted town where spooky stuff happens all the time, like every episode? But back to me and the Dead Boy Detectives. Despite having 2 British leads, the show is set in Port Townsend, Washington. A place I could have traveled to for this video if I hadn't spent the next month logging every supernatural TV show from the US, where it was set and where it was filmed. Why would I do that? Well, I love the genre, and don't you kind of want to know the most haunted state according to 2000s television? Now I'm going to give you a morsel of information that will entice you into the rest of this video. Look at this regional map of where the shows are set. Pretty interesting. When it came to acquiring data, I logged 177 shows that had at least one episode released between 2000 and 2024. I have not watched every single one of these shows, but through my life, I have seen 20% of them. And I don't know if that's sad because it's too many or sad because it's not enough. And because I haven't watched every single one of these shows, a big part of this system was using Wikipedia and fan sites to understand where shows were set. That means this data is probably not perfect. But I also can't imagine who would be a better person to learn from than someone who liked a show so much that they wrote a full fandom article on every single building in a fictional town. I trust them. And if you're wondering how I found every supernatural or horror adjacent show, it's because I clicked on nearly every single show that came out of every network. I usually use genre markers, but if it was in a category that felt adjacent to horror or supernatural, I went through and I read the synopsis. And there were parts of this where I had to make hard decisions. A sci-fi show about a plague? Not included. A sci-fi show about a plague that's zombies? Included. Reaper, a show about a jokester devil bringing souls and demons back to hell with a dirt devil? Included. God Friended Me, a show about God DMing a guy on Facebook? Not included. The line of what's supernatural really is in the eye of the beholder, and in this case, it's me. If you have an issue with that, you can try and roll a d20 to smite me in the comments. I had to set some ground rules for myself, or else I might die in this process and then haunt this Google Sheet with a Google Sheet over my head. So my rules were as follows. Only the United States. I'm trying to find the most haunted state, so I'm only including shows that are conceivably in the US. They can be filmed anywhere in the world. No episodic anthologies. The only invited anthologies were across an entire season or focused on one location. So shows like Them and American Horror Story got a line for each of their seasons. If your show moves around constantly and has no conceptual home base, you don't get a location. I wanted to include Z Nation as much as the next person with Zombie Brains for Brains, but when I saw this map, we just don't have the capabilities. And finally, for convenience's sake, I'm using regions and divisions in the US created by the one and only US Census. Should Oklahoma count as the Midwest? Maybe, but take it up with your government, not me. And also, no shows are set there, so you've got plenty of grievances to send out. If we were just going to avoid all pageantries, I could just tell you the most haunted television shows of the 2000s were set in California. You've got shows set in real places like Charmed in San Francisco or Angel in Los Angeles, but you've also got Buffy the Vampire Slayer in Sunnydale or Teen Wolf in Beacon Hills, both fake places in allegedly real California. But honestly, that's the least interesting part about this data. It makes a lot of sense that California is at the top of the list, because a lot of shows are filmed there. Of the 27 shows set in California, more than half are filmed there too. And of all the California shows, 17 of them take place in Los Angeles. Now, what's the big industry that Los Angeles is so famous for? Giant ants? No, that can't be right. I think it's the film industry. And it turns out Los Angeles isn't the only place guilty of double dipping their setting and their film location. Most shows are not filmed in the same place where they're set, but 30% are, with the majority being from Los Angeles, New York City, and the Atlanta area, places where film is a major business. So we need to find another way to see if a state is overrepresented. California is one of the most populated states in the US, so maybe it makes sense that it has 27 shows set there. So now we're at the part of the video where I'm gonna do some math. But don't worry, it's my favorite type, basic division. If we take the number of people who live in California and divide that by the US population and turn that into a percentage, California has 12% of the US population. And now, working with an only slightly smaller number, we can take the number of supernatural shows set in California, 27, and divide it by the total number of the genre, 177, which brings us to the bold 15%. So it's above what it should be, but not by a huge margin. And that's where I kind of had to put in some parameters. Although California is clearly overrepresented in the horror TV category, it's not by that much. And there are other states that are so impressively over-indexing that the community is going to have trouble beating the haunted allegations. Then there are other states that are getting very little haunted press compared to their size. So before I tell you why Tennessee should be scarier, I want to tell you about my favorite part of these shows. The fake city and town names. There are kind of two main categories: names that sound like convincingly real places, and names that sound like a rancid bottle of ranch dressing. There are about 60 fake town names on our list. Some are intended to sound like real places. Barrington-on-Hudson in Oktoberfaction versus the real Croton-on-Hudson. Versus Croton-on-Hudson in New York. Annville, Texas from Preacher versus Annaville, Texas. Eagle Point, Indiana from American Gods versus Eagle Point, Arizona from America with No Gods. These town names are clever, but they're not my favorite. I love the multi-word town name. Places that if you were driving by on a highway, you'd be like, let's not stop here for gas. I don't want to die in Mystic Falls. They're often trotting around the same topics: trees, water, something that could kill you. And together, they could make for some good, bad slam poetry. I'm in the Elk Grove, a Bristol Cove. Don't eat the Hemlock Grove. At Willard's Mill, we cut the white pine, west pine, wayward pines. All that's left when the last willow falls is me alone in Dark Score Lake, looking for a light. It's Beacon Hills, from my favorite show ever produced by MTV. And then everybody snaps. And this is an expected attribute for the supernatural horror space. I'm usually disappointed when a show doesn't bother doing a silly fake name for a location. And only 30% of the shows I logged do. And TV shows aren't the only place playing with this technique. In The Sims spooky packs, we get these perfect encapsulations of this genre. Forgotten Hollow, Moonwood Mills, Glimmerbrook. Places that when you move to, you shouldn't be surprised when an emaciated old vampire hypnotizes you through your wall for a drink of your blood. If you didn't want that, you should have moved to San Myshuno. Now let's get to the deeply underrepresented states in this category. This is a list of states with abundant populations that don't line up with the dearth of deadly shows. We're working backwards here. Tennessee, it's the 17th most populated state with 2.1% of the US population, but I couldn't find one supernatural show set here. Is Hollywood all out of ideas, or do they just not have the guts to do a show about a band of aspiring country star vampires living in Nashville who constantly feed on fresh bachelorette parties that come to town? Next, North Carolina, over 10 million residents, 3.1% of the US population, and not a ghost or a ghoul in Greensboro? I find that hard to believe. So far, the only show is American Horror Story's 6th season entitled Roanoke. Maybe there's an Outer Banks spin-off we could try, or a fictional retelling of the Wright brothers' first flight in North Carolina, but there was a guy standing on the wing of the plane, but only one of the brothers could see it. Then Ohio, the 7th most populated state at 3.5% of the US population. The show Channel Zero did a season set there. I could tell you more about it, but the promo art had something that made my stomach turn, so I had to get in and get out. Maybe if season 1 of Nightmare at 8 Feet does well, we can do an origin story of the Wright brothers growing up in Dayton, Ohio, and their mom's actually a griffin. There are no bad ideas in brainstorming, right? Only one show was set in Florida, despite it being the 3rd most populated state with 6.4% of the US population. And it's not even a full show. It's the season of American Horror Story called Freak Show. Rude. I would set a mermaid show here. Just make an aquamarine TV show already. I've read my comments. The fans are out there. There are tens of us. And finally, the most underrepresented state based on population, Texas. There are 4 shows set in Texas, seasons 4 through 8 of The Walking Dead, Preacher, and the short-running The Messengers and Midnight Texas. 4 is better than the rest, but not when you compare the 2.3% of haunted shows set there versus the 8.7% of the US population who lives there. Now, do we think these states are disappointed that they don't have horrific things happening in their fictitious backyard? I'm not sure. But then there are states that feel practically magnetized to the genre, regardless of the actual population size. We're going to go from pretty overrepresented to extremely overrepresented, starting with Massachusetts. Massachusetts has 2% of the US population, and 14 of these shows are set there. That's about 8% of the total, nearly 4 times more than their proportional population. You've got Fringe, Being Human, 2 seasons of American Horror Story, Sabrina the Teenage Witch. I think one of the reasons that a lot of shows find a home in Massachusetts is it's a state with a well-known history that's put effort into preserving it. The state already has experience cashing in on its presumed supernatural identity. The Salem witch trials was the biggest witch trial in the colonies, despite the people being murdered not being witches, and just being a really sad story of people put on trial because they were elderly, not white, disabled, homeless, poor, widowed. But it has been successfully remarketed as a supernatural event. Many TV shows not set in the state will still reference back to the Salem witch trials to try and explain a character's backstory. Backstory is actually why I think this state shows up again and again. Something I think shows set in the US are up against in the supernatural genre is that the country isn't that old, or at least it isn't perceived to be. If many supernatural characters are ageless, the vampire who's 300, the witch who never dies, the werewolf who ages slowly, you're quickly coming up against history that would have very little in common with the territory people are familiar with. And I think one of the reasons these supernatural shows are underrepresented in the South is because if you go back in time a couple hundred years, you now have to reckon with slavery in the United States. If completely avoided, it feels bad. If underplayed, it feels worse. And that's not to say Massachusetts wasn't guilty of slavery. The first woman accused in the Salem witch trials was enslaved. The trade of dried codfish out of New England was directly traded to feed enslaved people in Barbados in exchange for sugar, rum, and people. Slavery made merchants and captains in New England rich. But compared to states in the South like Virginia, where in 1860, 1/3 of the state's population were enslaved Black people, 550,000 people, it would be impossible to ignore that piece of history. Unless you're Vampire Diaries, then you completely ignored it. So if a show isn't interested in grappling with a complicated history, Massachusetts might feel like a simpler fit. Now, slightly more than Massachusetts, the second most haunted state in supernatural shows is Washington, with over 2% of the US population living here and 16 shows set here. I originally wanted to log all this information because I had a feeling this state was crushing it in the supernatural show department. In the past few years, it feels impossible to leave this state. Goosebumps, Dead Boy Detectives, School Spirits. Washington is in a never-ending press campaign for the foggiest place with ghosts. But I blame it on 3 factors. One is the media of yesterday. Twin Peaks. This show was made in the 90s and only lasted 2 seasons during its original run, but boy did those seasons make an impact. The show is set in a small mountain town named, you won't believe this, Twin Peaks. It's a detective drama, it's supernatural, but most of all, it's foggy and off-kilter. Countless show creators list Twin Peaks and David Lynch as their influence. We pretty much ripped off Twin Peaks. If you wanted to get that confession, the answer is yes. I love that show. They only did 30 episodes. Carrie and I thought we'd do the 70 that are missing. It's incredibly Twin Peaksy. We use Twin Peaks as inspiration a little bit. It's more gothic stuff, but really, all roads on Riverdale lead back to Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks changed what it meant to be an hour-long drama, and the setting was a big part of its appeal. And if that wasn't enough to put Washington on a map, might I interest you in an actual map? I think Washington is also doing well in the state fight for supernatural shows because a lot of shows are filmed in Vancouver. Washington State shares 437 miles of border with British Columbia. And of my list, 45 shows are filmed in that province. That's a quarter of the entire genre from 2000 to today. Vancouver and Washington might be in different countries, but they have a lot in common regarding terrain and weather, which might explain why nearly all shows set in Washington were filmed in British Columbia. Vancouver is like a colder Hollywood because they offer really enticing tax credits. It has created an entire industry that is booming. The final factor that can't be ignored is Twilight. Twilight was a huge film success in 2008, and it led to studios saying yes to more supernatural TV. Which is why for the past decade, I've been eating good. I don't think Teen Wolf or Vampire Diaries would have been greenlit or given such long seasons if it wasn't for the interest Twilight created. Now, Twilight being set in Washington isn't some remarkable plot, but instead because of a Google search. Stephanie Meyer was looking for the rainiest place, and she found it in Forks, Washington. And although a lot of these supernatural shows haven't directly followed in Twilight's footsteps in terms of location, I think its existence made more classically supernatural stories find a home on TV and increase the volume in general. But is it possible that one author could completely change the trajectory of how a state is portrayed in media? I think our most overrepresented state on this list will answer with a very spooky, kind of out-of-body, yes. This state has less than half a percentage point of the population of the United States, with just over 1 million people living there. There have been 7 shows set there, 4% of our total. That is 10 times more than the proportional population. I guess the state must really be a main character. 'Cause it's Maine. And there are a lot of factors that could be at play here. It's cold, it's foggy, it snows, it's got a long coastline, there's small islands, but it's got one thing that no other state has. Stephen Edwin King. He's called the King of Horror for a reason. I think one of the reasons is that his last name is King. But of the 7 shows set in Maine, 6 of them are based on his books or short stories. Kingdom Hospital, Castle Rock, Chapel Waite, Haven, Bag of Bones, The Mist. The only show set in Maine not made by him is Nancy Drew. And there's something funny about an entire state's haunted identity going back to just one guy who can't stop making his hometown sound terrifying. But if your state didn't make the list, maybe the best thing you can do is just become a prolific horror writer. Don't stop until people shudder when they think of Nebraska. I guess now that we've honed in on the most haunted state, I can explain why I did this in the first place. I have always been a grade A scaredy cat. I refuse to watch horror movies. I would politely leave the room if a scary movie was put on. And that's where supernatural horror television helped me out. I could experience horror within the safety of the television rating system. It put a threshold on how scary something was allowed to be if it wanted to keep its placement on primetime television. I watched Teen Wolf every single week, and it was slowly upping my tolerance for scary things. Because it turns out I didn't hate all things horror, I just hated jump scares. And I don't mind gore, but I'm terrified of monsters hiding and unflinching eye contact. These shows opened me up to watching more and more scary stuff. I was able to move on to movies, learn that I loved an entire genre. I know there are some horror heads who would be disturbed that Teen Wolf is what made me fall in love with the genre, but that's how new audiences get introduced to things. It's not always going to be the perfect medium that brings in the perfect audience. But rewatch the Dread Doctor season. Tell me it's not pretty perfect. My favorite thing about experiencing media is the other questions it can unlock. It's why I've done multiple videos on the Mansard Roof, because it kept coming up in the shows and movies I watch, and I wanted to learn more. And what I learned was they were using a house style to enhance their storytelling by leaning into the pre-existing history. In 1870, if you needed a renovation with an additional livable attic, while keeping up with the Victorian style, the Second Empire was your answer. And then decades later, it became associated with the Addams Family and Psycho. Today, you see the roof style in Lock and Key and Stranger Things. The media gets to borrow these real elements of our world to make far-fetched things seem more possible. And I think the same can be said for these haunted states. These places were chosen because they were in a convenient location, they had some media history, or a real-life history that was valuable to the story. Supernatural horror doesn't exist in real life, but it's a place to safely feel our fear. And by setting it in a place you're familiar with or have context for, you get closer to believing it's real. It invites you to a place where you can confront life and death and all the sad and mysterious things in between and give those feelings a home. Or, in our case, an entire state. This isn't my first time pulling data that I thought no one would care about, but if you do care about it, I'm sharing a copy of the spreadsheet on my Patreon. Also on there, I have a video ranking a bunch of my favorite shows from this list. If you don't want to spend money on the Patreon, I've also got a free newsletter. This month I talk about an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and why I looked into a building, just because it was featured for probably 1 minute tops in an entire episode. But anyway, it led me to Diana Ross. So if you like this video, subscribe, give it a like. I appreciate everyone being patient when my monthly videos take a little bit longer than a month, because I bite off far more than a non-werewolf can chew. Bye, everyone.